Welcome back, my friends, to this episode of the Intermediary Diaries, number 10. I am Artemis Treadwell, your storyteller. And at first, I think I owe you a little bit of an explanation as to the hiatus that I've been on recently. So here in, now it's July 1st of 2025, had to take off most of June last month because, getting older kind of has its challenges. And while I may look quite young, I was suffering from some occupational damage to my shoulder. The work that I do is fairly physical, and it eventually caught up with me, so I had to take a week off of work. It was extremely painful, my pain tolerance being terrible anyway. Had a rough time, sleeping, and then once I finally got back to work, had to catch up with that, and then got taken out by some gastrointestinal issue. I don't know, I'm starting to sound like an old man now, but anyway, had some trouble for the month of June. It was Focus on Health month for me, and now I'm back here with this episode, and I am going to talk to you about fairies. My personal experience with them has been slight, but even with that, I think it helps to give example to the different types of experiences that people have with fairies and why they might have that. So my interaction with a fairy was, from what I understand, more like a brownie. And I don't know personally too much about any of these topics because my personal philosophy is that I don't like to fill my head with, other people's stories and experiences, that if I'm going to have the experience, I would like to have it in a fairly novice mind, a fairly open mind, so that it's not influenced by other people's stories or information. So the little bit that I've had was one afternoon that I was actually working in somebody else's home here in Florida, and I looked up, and I'm in their living room, and down at the very bottom edge of their couch appeared to be a small humanoid figure that had lots of light brown tones to her, I'll say, because the figure seemed to be a very petite, more feminine type shape. And there were tiny little wings on the back, almost like dragonfly wings, very slight. And again, very, very fragile almost looking, very thin, and maybe, I don't know, about that high. We'll say maybe 10 inches or so, maybe less, 8 to 10 inches. And as I looked up and saw her, immediately she ducked underneath the couch. And it seemed to me that she was just watching, curious, and certainly was a little bit startled by the fact that I saw her, maybe didn't expect me to see her, and was just watching me. Didn't get the impression that there was anything more than just that. And of course I looked under the couch to see if there was anything like a dust bunny or a dog toy or a child's toy, something of that nature that might be underneath there. And nothing had rolled under there, and there was no other activity in the house at all, no other person moving around at that time. So I was fairly certain of what I had seen. And again, a fairly neutral interaction. And the more research that I did after the fact, when I discovered that it was probably a brownie, a type of fairy that I saw, of course, all of the mythology and the lore in Ireland, there are many stories about the fae interacting with humans in a somewhat mischievous or, in a conflict kind of way. And that the humans perhaps bumbled into that rather consciously, or with some action that they did were drawing that sort of ire towards them. So it was a little bit of a surprise to me to learn that many of the fairy lore have, I guess, a negative experience as told by the humans that write those stories down, whereas my experience was, if anything, kind of cute and curious, that she was just there, watching me. And as we've talked about in the series here, if you've seen the videos up to this point, that by the time I saw this brownie, I had spent quite a bit of time doing my own inner work and becoming as objective as possible, learning some humility and compassion and empathy. And so it's possible that now when I had a chance to see one of these entities, that it didn't have any negative intention for me, or any intention of harm, or in some way to essentially manipulate me for its own entertainment or what have you. It was just a curious sort of energy. And again, I think that's perhaps an anecdotal piece to keep in mind, that the more respectful we are, the more mindful we are, conscientious we are of minding our egos and being objective and having humility, that this can determine the type of interaction that we have with entities that might otherwise be labeled as mischievous or aggressors towards humankind. And something else that popped to mind too was this notion of privacy. Some people might come to this thinking, wow, I've got little people that are wandering around my house that maybe I'm not seeing. What else are they seeing? And, thinking about, how much privacy do they have? But privacy is one of those things that in other dimensions outside of here, from what I understand, doesn't really exist. That all entities are connected, up here, telepathically, you could say. And so there is no such thing as privacy. The only thing that keeps one entity from another is a mutual respect of that person's space or autonomy, or, what have you in that way. We here, humans, tend to, think, oh, this is my space, it's my house, my property, my this, my that, very selfish, ego-driven, and they must enforce that with force on everything else with force, without consideration for that other entity. And of course, we can look all throughout human history where, one group of people was habiting a place first, and then another comes along and says, to heck with you and your space, this is now mine. And, no mutual respect or cooperation at all. So it's interesting that in the non-human realm, in the faerie realm, we'll say, they don't need to forcefully push the idea of privacy and my, things onto anybody. There's just this mutual respect and understanding of, I will do as you request, basically. Maybe going back a little bit to the fairy lore from Ireland, where they have certain places like groupings of boulders or groupings of trees, certain types of trees, or places in the forest or the land where they recognize, perhaps through trial and error because they were not being respectful in the first place, that those areas were places where fairies first inhabited. And so they avoid drawing the kind of aggressive, manipulative, maybe negative behavior from fairies by respecting those places and not going to those places. And if they are going to go, find some way to communicate a request to visit in a respectful way. And again, if there wasn't that human ego that just insists that whatever they come across, they claim, they plant the flag as theirs, that maybe some of those less savory interactions wouldn't happen in the first place. And this reminds me of a story, speaking of fairies, that Tillie told me about a friend that she had when she was a young child and growing up. And this was, I think, a fairy. And she said that this individual, that she later named Beau, approached her as a child outside and asked if he could come inside the house and observe the family, just watch. which is the impression that I got from that little brownie that I saw. And, her being a child, open-minded, yeah, sure, come on in and watch the family. No big deal. It's fine. And so there was that initial asking for permission to come and watch and be in the same space as, which is consistent with non-human practice and psychology, so fairies included. And Tillie described to me, when she described to me the way that Bo looked, didn't seem to me to be like what we expect the average fairy, or how we present the average fairy to be, which is like a humanoid type figure, leprechauns or, fairies with wings, anything like that. She described this non-human entity, and to me it sounded like more animal than humanoid. So she said that Bo had sometimes bat wings, sometimes butterfly wings, and the body shape took on more of like a wolf, but the limbs were bent like backward. They articulated the limbs bent backward in a certain way, but it was a very small, maybe basketball-sized creature. So when you think about the legs, think of like flamingos. How they, bend at that joint that way, instead of a typical wolf's legs, had legs more like that. And then had a tongue like a butterfly. So for any of you animal nerds out there like me in real life, in order to sip up the nectar, butterflies have that, long curly tongue. So he had that, and his eyes changed periodically between goat's eyes and cat's eyes. Just depended on, I guess, what sort of look he wanted. And he had long, thin, pointy ears, kind of like, I guess, elves, how those are usually described. And, the wolf body being more like that grayish kind of color. So a pretty cool looking, chimera sort of creature, in my opinion. But I'm sure as a child, if I had seen that in my human presentation here, and the human brain that I have, probably would have been absolutely terrified of that. But she named him Bo, and then accepted the invitation for him to come in and watch the family. And occasionally, other family members would be able to hear Bo chirping, because he did give those sort of noises, I guess, as a form of communication, but also just the type of noise that he made, but could communicate telepathically with Tillie versus through, chirping, which I imagine is probably not a language that Tillie speaks. If it is, she hasn't told me yet. So that was her version, her interaction with a fairy that, along the same lines, asked before entering the personal space, that sort of respect that is typical for non-human entities. That just got me thinking that this idea that we have of privacy really is sort of an illusion, a construction that we as humans have created, and that a lot of these entities are probably around us all the time, and that we aren't perceiving them either because they don't wish to be perceived, or we don't create an inviting persona or environment to give them reason to want to interact with us, and maybe just watch from a distance, or at worst, if we act in aggressive ways or disrespectful ways, that we might actually draw the kind of interaction that we don't want from non-human entities, or fairies especially, as the lore goes. So perhaps, as I've been saying in many of these videos, if we clean up our vibration, do our inner work, and aim to be more compassionate, objective, and empathetic, we might have more interactions, pleasant ones, with fairies that we might enjoy, and avoid the less savory types of interactions. And I appreciate all of your guys' patience in my hiatus that I've gone on, and I'm glad to be back here. Of course, comments down below for any stories that you have that are what you think fairy or fae specific would be greatly appreciated as well. And until the next episode, a little bit further on down the road here on the Weird Walk Home, thank you for joining. We'll see you next time.